The two observatories that I have recently visited are Yerkes Observatory in Williams Bay, Wisconsin, and Perkins Observatory near Delaware, Ohio. And they're both great places to visit, and they're both at just about the same distance away from us. And here we go. How do we get there? Well, it's a short trip for either one of these. It's about 3 hours and 43 minutes to get to Yerkes Observatory from Kalamazoo. You just drive down around the bottom end of Lake Michigan, up through Chicago with white knuckles, and you'll eventually get to Williams Bay, Wisconsin. It takes about 4 hours to make the drive. 3 hours and 55 minutes to get to Delaware, Ohio. You just go the other way out of Kalamazoo on I-94. Down to 69 into Fort Wayne, take a left turn and head over to 23 in Ohio and down to Delaware. So the two observatories are about equivalent distances apart from us. So 4-hour drive either way, and you get to visit one or the other. And we're going to start out with Yerkes Observatory. I've made numerous visits to Yerkes in the past, even predating the 2014 that I've listed there. 2014, I went with the Digistar users group. We were in a conference, then we're up in northern Wisconsin, came down to Yerkes, and then went to Chicago for International Planetarium Society meeting. The same day that I was there was a group from the Kalamazoo Astronomical Society there. So we just coincidentally showed up the same day, same place. 2022, that was a couple of years ago. I went back there because I wanted to photograph a polar star trail over the top of the observatory. And 2023, after getting a good polar star trail looking north over the observatory, I thought, you know, it'd be a nice place to get a picture of the Milky Way looking south over the observatory. So I went back there again. By that time, they were almost ready to be open again for visitation. In fact, they are open for visitation now. And I went back on May 11th of this year to get a look through the 40-inch telescope. And I went back again in August of this year to take the Director's Hidden Spaces tour. And I'm going back again in 1 week for another look through the 40-inch telescope, this time on the autumn objects. Real quick, brief history of this. The name George Ellery Hale is very important to astronomers. He had wanted to observe a transit of Venus, the one before these two that Richard just mentioned to us. And to be able to do that, he got his dad to buy him a 4-inch Clark refractor. But I wish I had a dad like that. Anyway, he observed the transit, and that got him really interested in astronomy. He went to MIT, where he invented the spectrohelioscope, and he went on to study spectroscopy under Pickering at Harvard. I'm going to keep reading this. He returned home to Kenwood, Illinois, and in Kenwood, Illinois, he built a small observatory, which his dad equipped with a 12-inch Clark refractor and some spectroscopic equipment. Well, about that time, William Rainey Harper, who was the the president of the University of Chicago, which had just opened at that time, decided that he was going to build a $250,000 observatory. And he needed somebody to run that observatory, and he had heard about this George Ellery Hale guy, and decided it'd be nice to bring him on because he already had a working observatory, the Kenwood Observatory. He asked if he could relocate that on the campus of the University of Chicago. Daddy said, well, if you're going to do that, I want you to hire my son to be the director of your observatory. Done deal. In 1892, Hale and Harper went to talk with Charles T. Yerkes, the most hated man in Chicago. And the reason they went to talk to him was because they were looking for somebody to provide funding for the telescope to go into the observatory. It turned out that they had tried a number of other people first and been turned down, but Yerkes had a bad reputation and he wanted to clean it up a little bit, and he figured by making a big donation he could do that. So he donated the money for the telescope. It was supposed to be the largest and best telescope in the world. But it had to be located within 100 miles of Chicago. They went looking for a site, and they found this lake up in Wisconsin, Lake Geneva, where all the rich people from Chicago had their summer cottages. And they figured, well, this would be a nice place to put the observatory because we've got all these contacts for more money for equipping the observatory and things in the future. So they got Warner and Swasey to design and build the telescope, the mount, and the dome, and put the observatory up at Williams Bay, Wisconsin. And the University of Chicago owned the observatory and the telescope up until the year 2020, when it's transferred over to the Yerkes Futures Foundation. So let's take a quick tour of the observatory. There are a lot of really interesting architectural features on this observatory. If you go there, make sure that you've got some time in the afternoon to look over the building and the grounds. On the dome to the 40-inch telescope, if you go look at the sculptures on the side walls, there's a sun there. And there's a bunch of moons over by the doors of the observatory. There are these guys. I don't know exactly what those things next to them are, but this one's yelling to get off the grass. And the one over there is holding up a little sundial and pointing up at the sun, probably trying to tell you, it's getting late, you better get in the observatory to do your work. William Rainey Harper, Andrew Carnegie, he's got a really big nose. He had a really big nose. And when they put him into the columns at the observatory entrances, they had a big wasp on his nose because he got stung for the money to build the actual building of the observatory. And the guy on the end, Charles T. Yerkes, you'll find him in different carvings around the observatory, and they all have little horns because he was the most hated man in Chicago at the time. As you walk around the observatory, there's a lot of things to keep your eyes out for. You'll see the little sculptures and stuff like that. These are the windows. This one's taken from inside, that one's taken from outside. The three windows on the bottom are all glass photographic plates. There was a period of time in the 29 to 30, 31 range where they didn't have money to replace broken glass in the observatory, but they had a lot of glass plates sitting in their library, and they took some of the ones that weren't quite so good and just used them to make the windows. As you enter into the observatory, you come into this area, and from the south entrance where you enter, it's straight across to the north entrance. And if you go off to the left, you're going toward the steps that lead up to the 40-inch dome. If you go off to the right, you go past a little gift shop and a classroom. And then farther down, there's a break where the hall goes north and south. And that's where the two smaller domes are located. But of course, this is what you're going to see, the 40-inch telescope, the world's largest refracting telescope. It's a two-element lens. We're gonna run over time now. Two-element lens, crown glass, flint glass, and they're air-spaced. And the lens diameter is 40 inches. The length of the telescope is 60 feet. And it weighs, I think it was 68 tons. So think about moving that around a little bit. Okay. Still waiting for slides to change. There is a smaller 40-inch reflecting telescope in one of those smaller domes. I can't tell you which one it was because we went through an underground maze to get to the dome that we went into. And there's a third dome. I don't know what's there. Yerkes has a lot of glass plate photography, and they have some of them on display. And left to right, we've got Saturn, we've got Brooks Comet, we've got a globular cluster, and we've got the M33 galaxy. Hope they look a little sharper for those people who are watching on the internet. This is the current director of the Yerkes Futures Foundation. His name is Dennis Kuss. He's standing in front of the cabinets that hold the photographic plate collection. Each plate is in an envelope, and they're being maintained because they're a record of past observations that you can use to look back and find out how stars have moved over time and find out how stars have changed in brightness over time. They're going to be scanned and put into a digital library, but they will maintain the glass plates as well. Speaking of libraries, there are a lot of books. Yerkes has one of the largest astronomy libraries. They had a lot of duplicates. They sent their duplicate book collection down to McDonald Observatory to start up the McDonald Observatory library. So there are connections between the different observatories. Yerkes also has machine shops and an optical shop where they can put together instrumentation to use. Okay, ready to move on now to Perkins Observatory. I've been there a couple of times too, but not as often as to Yerkes. The previous visit I had to Perkins was back when there was an Astronomical League conference there, and it was sometime between 1991, when they took out the 69-inch telescope and put in the 32-inch telescope, and 1998, when they tore down the Big Ear radio telescope, which was out back of the observatory. So I can kind of get it to a 5-year range. Sometime around 1995, I was there last. And this year I went down there on July 20th. They have 2 months of the year when they don't do their nighttime observing programs. They offer nighttime observing every Friday. But during the summer, because it doesn't get dark until so late, they have solar observing programs that take place. And these happen on Saturday afternoons. So there's all the observers set up with their solar telescopes to let people look through them, and you get the tour of the observatory along with it. Brief history of this observatory. Back in 1892, Hiram Perkins was brought into the Wesleyan College in Ohio, and he became the professor of astronomy and mathematics there, where he served for a number of years. Prior to that, he had been a hog farmer, and he had made a big fortune selling salt pork to the Union Army during the Civil War. He considered that to be blood money, and when he retired from teaching, he still had all this money, and it had grown because he had invested it. And he donated the money back to the college to build an observatory. The plan was that they'd put in about a 24-inch telescope. He was there for the groundbreaking of the observatory, but he died about a year later. So he never got to see the completed observatory. The first director who came in, Clifford C. Krupp, consulted with Edwin Frost, who was the second director over at Yerkes Observatory, about telescopes, because he didn't know much about telescopes. And somehow he got the idea of, oh, well, I need to have a big reflecting telescope here, because the limit of how big you can make a refracting telescope is about 40 inches. And there's already a big one over there. So he decided to have a 69-inch telescope made, but he could not get it made by any of the European glass companies, because they were all pretty much out of business after World War I. So he had to find somebody in the States who could make it, and he went to the National Bureau of Standards, because there were no companies in the United States that made glass mirror blanks. So they made 4 attempts, and it was on the 4th attempt that they finally got the 69-inch mirror blank put together. It was ground polished and figured by James Flecker, who went on to run the Brashear Telescope Company. And the contract for the mounting, the dome, and the telescope structure went to Warner and Swasey, who had previously built the telescope at Yerkes Observatory. So you start seeing that these things are becoming kind of related to one another. The observatory, with this giant telescope now, it was originally planned for 24-inch, it was now up to 69-inch. The Ohio Wesleyan could not afford to operate it. So they got an agreement to bring in Ohio State University as a co-operator of the observatory. In 1991, the 69-inch telescope was taken down and sent to the Anderson Mesa station of Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, where it was for some time. That mirror has now been replaced with a 72-inch mirror, and the 69-inch mirror went back to COSI in Columbus, Ohio, where it sat on racks for a while, and they are trying to reacquire it to put it on display back at the Perkins Observatory sometime in the future. Okay, let's move on. Like Yerkes, there's a lot of carvings inside of the design of the Perkins Observatory. You've got a couple of goddesses. This one's holding a ball, which represents the sun. This one's holding a ball, which represents the moon. If you look carefully, you can even see the dark seas. on the moon. Over the windows of Perkins Observatory, you find that they've got these marble plaques with the names of some of the great astronomers. The one on the far end is Galileo, the one on this end is Copernicus. And if you go around, there are 16 of them altogether. Here we are going into the telescope dome. And inside the telescope dome, that's Don Stevens, who's the director of Perkins Observatory, who's talking to us about the observatory itself. If you look behind him, you can see this big concrete slab. That's the North Pier. This was an English fork mounting, which has two piers. That pier is empty. The other pier has the 32-inch telescope that now resides at the observatory. Until earlier this year, this is the largest telescope that I've ever looked through. I went to Yerkes Observatory and got to look through their 40-inch telescope. So these are the two biggest observatories I have ever looked through. Like the observatory in Chicago or Williams Bay, the observatory in Delaware, Ohio, has a fair-sized library. They also have it set up with various displays that are around it. When you go into the observatory and do the tour, you can just walk through and see everything at your own pace. And I've made a few trips to other observatories where it would be easy to go out and take a visit yourself. There's the James C. Veen Observatory, which is Grand Rapids Amateur Astronomical Association. There's the University of Michigan's Detroit Observatory, which is on the north end of the campus. And there's Eastern Michigan University's observatory, which is on top of one of the buildings downtown Ypsilanti. So they're places you might want to visit and take a closer look at.